Another race, another accolade to add to the list. Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen, for the first time ever, is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to episode 36 of F1 in Review, the episode in the hour where we discuss the Mexican Grand Prix. I'm Tom Clabon, and as ever I'm joined by Tristan Fancourt and Angus Gallager. A reminder that you can follow myself and Tristan individually on Twitter, as well as the F1 in Review account, where these episodes are posted sporadically once they've gone out on the podcast provider of your choice, and also River Radio. So first of all, we start off with something which came before this Grand Prix, to be honest. This is the news that Red Bull Racing have been fined $7 million and have had a 10% reduction in wind tunnel time, which is for research and development for those who are interested over the next 12 months or a year, while Aston Martin, who were also found to breach the rules, have been fined $450,000 for 12 cases of, quote, incorrectly excluding and or adjusting costs in their cost cap submission. We're saying as well that Williams were nearly in breach of the cost cap rules but changed it at the last minute and were able therefore to avoid any punishment. It's worth saying as well that both teams accept wrongdoing and have reached a accepted breach agreement with the FIA, and therefore they've got these sanctions, shall we say, in terms of wind tunnel time and also financial fines as well. Red Bull were found to have breached the cap to the tune of $2.2 million after inaccurately excluding or adjusting a number of their costs, and the FIA acknowledged that a tax credit, if it were correctly applied, would have meant that Red Bull were just over $500,000 over the cost cap limit, shall we say. Finally, for me, an FIA statement reads as follows: there is no accusation or evidence that Red Bull has sought to at any time act in bad faith, dishonesty or in a fraudulent manner, nor has it willingly concealed any information from the cost cap administration. So what do we make then of Red Bull being found guilty, as well as Aston Martin being found guilty to their own admissions of breaking the cost cap rules for this season, or last season should I say, of the F1 season?
Yeah, and what an interesting breaking of the rules it is, because when we discussed this a couple of weeks back now, because it has taken them a long time to get to this point, i.e. we now know just to the extent in which Red Bull overspent. So every team has to be within the cost cap budget, and unfortunately they've overspent. And we were very harsh, I think. We all came down on the side of if you've overspent, you should be quite heavily punished. And I think they have actually quite heavily punished Red Bull. And to be clear, I think that you're going to fall down on this particular subject in one of, as a two, maybe three, if we're feeling nice, sort of ways. The first is you think that this was not a punishment enough. How dare they overspend? It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. A single penny over the amount, and that's it. Max Verstappen should have all of his titles taken away from him. Christian Horner should be fired on the spot immediately, and Red Bull would have to come grovelling back in 2025 after a 3-year suspension. Gah. So we got that. Or you are on the side of this was way too harsh. Come on, it's only a minor overspend. How could the FIA be so cruel and heartless to poor little Max? All he wanted to do was, make some waves in F1 and win a couple of championships. And look, it's only a tax credit, problem. Only smidgy little bit of an overspend. How could the FIA be so horrible? And everyone in the FIA should be fired until 2025 when they should come back grovelling and on their knees. They should pray to the fans and our omnibenevolence, and we will forgive them one by one after they make some sort of minor sacrifice. And I feel like we've had that sort of split bipolar attitude, and I think the FIA have actually come down somewhere in the middle of those, whereby it is pretty harsh, the penalty. Firstly, we should talk about the aero percentage and the 10% reduction in wind tunnel time that Red Bull will have. Now, at the moment, the way it works is you get a percentage of the maximum aero or the wind tunnel time, depending on when you finish it this year. So if, for example, you finish in first place, you get 70% of the 100% time for testing in a wind tunnel. So let's say for argument's sake it's 10 days worth, so 8 hours a day, so it's 80 hours. Let's imagine for a moment they say, yeah, you're allowed 80 hours total. So first place, you would allow 70% of that 80 hours. Third place, you get 80%, so second place 75%, third 80%, fourth 85%, fifth 90%, sixth 95%, and seventh you get 100%. So if you come in seventh place, you get 100% time of what the FIA says the standard wind tunnel time. Now I hear what you're thinking, but hold a minute. You what happens if you come in 8th, 9th, or 10th? And well, in fact, you get more wind tunnel time than 7th. So in 8th, you get 105% of the standard allotted wind tunnel time. 9th, you get 110%. And finally, in 10th, last place, you get 115% of the total allotted wind tunnel time, the standard wind tunnel time. And so what does this mean for Red Bull? Well, what it means is of that 70%, Red Bull have got a 10% penalty applied to that. So they will get 63% of the standard allotted wind tunnel time. So compared to, I'm going to hedge my bets here, Williams, which is currently sort of in last place, Red Bull will have nearly half the wind tunnel time than they will. And I think that's, a pretty severe punishment. Having that reduction in time to test your aerodynamic performance, I think will impact them. Christian Horner pulled a number out from, I don't know where, I'm going to say a hat for PC purposes, and said that it was going to lose them about 0.2 of a second, which, well, we'll find out how true that is going into the next year. But I think he made that up on the spot. Like, oh yeah, it loses 0.2 of a second.
Yes, the cost cap question finally resolved. As you rightly pointed out, Tristan, there's lots, as you went into with the level of detail, there's lots of layers to this, lots and lots of layers. More layers than some people on Twitter seem to have, like you said, because it's either, you can't these days apparently have nuance or be in the middle. You have to be one extreme or the other. Like, you're not allowed to have an opinion which takes into account both sides. You got to back your horse and then never get off that horse. But on a serious note, I think from my personal point of view, having initially, I think that my initial reaction was, well, they've overspent, the rule's been put out there, and even if the overspend is minor, which it was, it came in the region of about 1.8 million, which of course doesn't sound minor, but when you bear in mind the overall budget cap spend is in the 140 to 145 million region, that is very small. That's under 1% of an overspend. Mm-hmm. And I can see the point of view of people who are saying, well, it's not that much, it's only catering costs. And the other reasons which were put out there was it was catering, sick pay, redundancies for employees who'd been on long-term medical leave and other, what some might say are arbitrary reasons. But at the end of the day, I'm still of the view that whilst I don't think that there needs to be points taken off from the championships of Verstappen and Red Bull over the last couple of years. I think that would have been an overreaction, realistically. I still think that the punishment perhaps could have been more severe. I think that the fine could have been greater, I think that's one thing. $7 million, again, people say, well, that's a hefty fine, so that's enough. But I think, in terms of, I'm comparing it in my head to, there's a famous instance back in the first season I watched Formula 1, 2007, where basically McLaren and Ferrari were battling in the championship that year, and McLaren basically got passed on secrets to do with the Ferrari car from one of the Ferrari technical chiefs, and basically then copied parts of the Ferrari car and then got thrown out of the constructors and fined $150 million, which was a record sports fine at the time, and I think possibly still is. Now, I'm not saying Red Bull should have been fined $150 million, not at all, because they have not cheated by taking secrets from another team's car.
Yeah.
At the same time, they have overspent on a rule which was outlined, and even if Christian Horner has said things like, for example, he said that in 2020, most teams, in fact all teams except Red Bull, did a practice dry run of the cost cap proceedings with all the auditory processes and the finance calculations as a dry run to see what it would be like. And he just said, we didn't do that. And even if that's the case, surely you should be like, well, that's not our problem. That's like your issue for not having enough foresight to do that. And the other thing being the fact that they were talking about, this, and also the fact that, how they just had this dry run. Like, for me, it shouldn't be an excuse. It shouldn't be, or even Red Bull saying, oh, it was a mistake on our part, like we made an audit mess up. Well, if that's the case, it should be punished more, in my opinion. I think the fine could have been heftier. That's what I'm saying. I'm interested to see how the aerodynamic wind tunnel sanction affects them, because the rules being, like you said, Tristan, how they now have fewer points of aerodynamics which they can, and wind tunnel time which they can use, which happens anyway because a recent ruling has come in the recent past is that the higher up you finish in the Constructors' Championship, the less wind tunnel time you get the year after. Now, this doesn't completely flip the standings, because someone like Red Bull, even with a reduced wind tunnel time, would still produce 9 times 10 times out of 10 would produce a faster, more aerodynamically efficient car than someone like Haas, who has a much smaller budget and smaller facilities anyhow. But Red Bull is so far ahead at the moment, you feel. Verstappen once again, if we go to talk about the on-track matters, which we'll come on to, Verstappen once again dominated the field against a more resurgent Mercedes car and also a teammate with home support. He once again just dominated. And that's obviously down to the driver, but that's a car as well, which gives him the facilities to just frankly wipe the floor with the field sometimes. So whether that affects Red Bull too much, like, we'll see, really. Some might say, well, Mercedes wiped the floor with the field in 2020, and then in 2021 Red Bull were on their tail and it was nip and tuck between them the whole year. And yes, that could happen next year, but at this point in time, you think, will the aerodynamic cut down, wind tunnel time cut down, affect Red Bull that much? And it's very easy to see a scenario where they come out next year and they're still quicker, and then from then it'd be interesting to see what people think and whether the punishment suffices, and also like where we go from here in terms of, if we had a similar overspend in the future, would the same punishment be put down on a team? If there was a bigger overspend, let's say a team, this is fanciful, but let's say a team overspent by $10 million and they properly messed up, would they then have the absolute book thrown at them? Who knows? I feel like the FIA has been, in some parts, it's given out a justified punishment. I think the wind tunnel time overall is fair, and they shouldn't have been draconian, even though Christian Horner says this is draconian. I'm not buying that personally. But obviously he's got a biased point of view, being the team principal. But I feel like the fine could have been bigger. That's my one thing with it. $7 million for a team like Red Bull seems like, I don't want to say it seems like peanuts, but I think that there could have been a greater chance to put down a stronger penalty. But I think that perhaps overall it satisfies quite a few people in the paddock, realistically.
I agree, and I can't quite believe I'm saying this after the last few episodes, I should say, but I actually think the FAA have done a pretty good job with this. When you look at their financial punishment, coupled with the wind tunnel deduction for Red Bull next season, I think they've actually got a nice balance, really, because for context, this is the second biggest fine in F1 history. If you look back to, let's say, the Racing Point Pink Mercedes fine more recently, that was not even $500,000, and then as you mentioned there, Angus, the Spygate one was 100 million, if not in excess. So I think 7 million is good in of itself because it is a strong deterrent for the future, I think, as well. When you look at someone like Aston Martin, who have also been fined for a procedural breach, not a cut and dry overspend, but for literally putting in their submission wrong, they've been fined close to $500,000 US. So that is a deterrent in of itself, not only not to overspend, but also to make sure you submit everything correctly, you don't take liberties, and you make sure you follow the book as everyone else has done. But coupled with that, with the wind tunnel time deduction, that in real terms now means that Red Bull have 25 runs versus 28, and it's looking like Williams will be the last place in the constructors. They'll have 46, so there is a clear gap there between, let's say, the top and the bottom. It's designed as it is to make sure there's more a level playing field. But when you consider that Red Bull have 25 versus Ferrari having 30, and then Mercedes 32, you're comparing Red Bull with two like-for-likes when it comes to Ferrari and Mercedes in terms of their manpower, in terms of their resources, in terms of their drivers as well. So I think that is quite a clear punishment, and we could see this moving forwards having ramifications in terms of next season. But I think there's part of the sort of Formula One community who aren't going to be happy with this fine until they see Red Bull either not win a race or not win a championship, which is impossible to do or to make certain because of the talent they have both in the car and then also Adrian Newey and co behind the scenes. So the idea that we're not going to go and see Red Bull being demoted to third or fourth place, there's no certainty in that. But then again, just because they don't go on to become second or third or don't not win a championship next year doesn't mean the punishment is insufficient or weak or doesn't deter in the future, because this is, as the FIA have said themselves, a minor breach of the cost cap submission and the submission they had to put forwards as well. So in that regard, a £7 million US fine is quite hefty, which, yes, Red Bull could swallow that to an extent, but when you couple that with a wind tunnel time submission and the reduction there's no way they can escape this. But if this were to be just a financial fine, it would be more easy for them to do so. So in that regard, I think they have got that right. But then again, as we say, there's speculation moving forwards in terms of what would a major financial breach do in terms of ramifications, in terms of a sanction, in terms of something like that. I think what the FIA need to do moving forward is clearly lay out, if you breach the cost cap submission by X amount or by a certain amount more than this, then it will result in X, Y, or Z, because if they don't do that, there's a danger that they could be accused by some of making it up as they go along, which I don't think they've done in this regard, because it's taken them, first of all, quite a serious length of time for them to come together and to put forward a submission. This has also been reached with the team as well, so it's not like they're slapping down something that's draconian, as Christian Horner says, because the teams themselves have accepted wrongdoing. So they've reached an amicable agreement where each party's listening to the other, and they come to one where it goes, well, that's fair enough, that is a fine that's going to damage us from one extent in terms of the FIA saying, well, this is a punishment, this is a sanction, but then it's not going to be one that seriously cripples a team and it falls down to, let's say, 8th, 9th or 10th, because if we set a precedent where you seriously punish a team both on the track and off the track for what is, as the FIA say themselves, a minor breach of the rules and something which wasn't done in a fraudulent manner or done to ultimately beat the competition by cheating, then you set a dangerous precedent of teams falling down the order and then potentially dropping out of the sport. Because if this were to happen, let's say, to a smaller team or a team that wasn't as invested in Formula One, well, they may go, well, we've only just broken the rules by a small amount. It wasn't a malicious act we've done, and here we are struggling to keep our head above water. So I think they've done the right balance there. I think any more than 7 million in terms of, let's say, 20 or 25 would, in my view, be excessive, but 7 million and a multi-layer approach in my mind is quite fair, really. But it remains to be seen what happens now in terms of whether the deterrent is strong enough, or what comes next if another team does breach it more than Red Bull have done, and Aston Martin as well.
Do you know what this feels like? It feels like going back to 2019 before all of this kicked off, before the infamous Michael Massey scenes of last year, and when the biggest argument in Formula 1 was how Ferrari was so fast, and the 2019 engine investigation that occurred because everyone in the paddock were wondering really why Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc were so fast in their Ferraris, and the FIA sort of investigated off the back of that, although I don't think there was a formal protest by the team because the teams couldn't really work out how, and so they hadn't yet formalised a complaint. But the FIA investigated Ferrari anyway, and subsequently a technical directive was issued, and a second fuel flow sensor was installed on the engines, and there was this famous settlement between the FIA and Ferrari, and there was outrage in the community that Ferrari had obviously done something against the rules, they said, and it's unfair that Ferrari were going to go through the season with this out of spec engine, and how dare they, because they're going to have such an advantage going into 2020. And of course 2020 rolled round, Ferrari's engine was massively down on power. Clearly the technical directive and changes to the rules had impacted them severely, and everyone kind of dropped it. And everyone was Ferrari's so slow, if you're a Ferrari fan, sucks to be you, this sort of thing. And so clearly what the FIA did, it did intercept Ferrari on some way, and did force them to make changes to make the engines closer, should we say, to the rules. I'm not totally sure what, as I don't think anyone is apart from Ferrari, sure what actually changed, but chances are they limited the fuel flow in some way. And so I feel like we're going to have the same thing here, where because Red Bull have yet to be impacted by the penalty, we're going to have commentators from the sidelines shouting about how it's not going to impact them. And until next year, when we find out whether or not the penalty it has or will impact Red Bull, these voices aren't going to die down. But I'm willing to bet you they will if Red Bull come out of the gates and are 3/10 down from everyone else. And Christian Horner stands there and says, well, it's because we couldn't get enough wind tunnel time. I won't hear those voices saying, oh, I'm sorry for being so angry about this. I'm sorry for shouting so loudly. And yeah, I guess if it doesn't impact Red Bull, then the FIA will revise it. But as you say, Tom, we do need to know what the penalties will be, depending on the severity of the cost cap breach. I have no idea what the penalty for Red Bull would have been if they had exceeded the cost cap by more than 5%. If it had been a major breach of the cost cap, what happens if it's 10%, 20%? Does it scale? If you do 100% extra of the budget cost cap. If you were to spend 140 million extra on top of the 140 million budget that you had for this year, what would the penalty for that be? I assume disqualification, but nobody actually knows. So it feels a bit like what we went through in 2019 with the whole rigmarole of what it felt like the FIA making it up to restrict Ferrari, and no one really knowing what that settlement will be. This one's a bit more in the public, but in reality, we need to have a table, if you'd like, of severity and adequate punishments, so that all the teams are playing by the same rules when they enter into the next year. Because otherwise, teams could take liberties with the expectation that they won't be penalised as much as they or we would expect.
Yeah, and here's a question for you both. Do you think that if there is a more severe breach moving forwards, or indeed for the breach that's been accrued by both Aston Martin and by Red Bull, should there be a hangover in terms of minus points for the Constructors' Championship they start on next season? I.e., should they be both in 9th and 10th, let's say Aston Martin with, for argument's sake, minus 15 points and Red Bull with minus 25, because after all it's the teams that have broken the rules, not the drivers. Do you think that's fair, or are you surprised that's not on the table or not been put forward by the FIA?
That's an interesting proposal. I think that it's a bit like I'm thinking you're thinking there about football, possibly, where if there's a financial breach, for example, if a club has to go into administration, then they start the season on minus points. I think that's one solution that could actually work in terms of putting teams off breaking the rules when it comes to the cost cap. I think that would work still though best if it dovetailed with a fine, and also with some sort of like financial further financial penalty. That could work, to be fair, and I think that but again, it's one of those where ironically I feel like it would have to be verified by the teams, and would the teams agree? I don't know, but that's not a bad suggestion, to be fair.
Well, there is precedent for the deduction of points, and again, casting our minds back just a little bit, Racing Point, which are now Aston Martin in 2020, were deducted 15 points at the end of a season due to the rules and the legality over their car. It was back in the days when Racing Point copied the Mercedes car, and I believe it was their brake ducts. It was a part of the car which you couldn't copy through lines of sight. They would have had to have obtained the technical drawings, right? This was deep within the car, or deep within the wheels, and so you couldn't just see it. So they must have taken technical drawings. And the FIA turned around and said, right, you're getting a €400,000. I say that like a parrot, like, you know, some sort of naughty, on the naughtiest Racing Point, but they got €400,000 fine and deducted 15 World Championship points, which eventually left them losing to McLaren, I believe, that year. Maybe one of you can look that up as I'm speaking. And, you know, that had serious knock-on consequences for them. And I think in 2021 as well, they still had problems with the braking and the cooling system because they had to engineer their own system from then going forward, and they couldn't access the technical directives from Mercedes. Very interesting that Mercedes didn't get fined for that. I still think they probably should have, because they must have obtained them from someone in Mercedes, unless there's like spying going on. But anyway, so to answer your question, Tom, in a very long and rambly sense, I apologise. There is precedent for points and World Championship points being deducted. I'm almost surprised the FIA didn't deduct points this time, but perhaps they felt that there was no cheating or no malice there from Red Bull. But yes, I do believe that if you cheat by a significant margin, points should be deducted from either the season before or, as you suggest, going into the next season. I think if you had a massive advantage, let's take Red Bull, for example, and I apologise, Red Bull, I'm picking on you because you're at the front of my mind. Let's imagine Red Bull had breached it by 15%. So that would be, you know, a significant breach, you know, nearly 20 million or so dollar breach. Then they might say, right, well, we're gonna make sure that you are heavily impacted, so the reduction of wind tunnel time, massive fine, but also we're deducting 30 World Championship points from your total next year, which I think they could do because they have already deducted World Championship points from, for example, Racing Point, and I think that would be a significant deterrence. My only thing, though, I think it would be a penalty that perhaps would negatively impact the slower teams, for lack of a better word, or the teams that are falling in the lower places, simply because they can't make up the points deficit as easily as a massive team would be able to.
I mean, let's be fair to the FIA. For all we know, they could have proposed a points deduction forward-looking or retrospectively as part of their breach agreement with be it Aston Martin, Red Bull or both, and they both said, or either of them said, no chance. Give us more of a fine in terms of the financial sense, or give us more wind tunnel time deduction, or deduce our wind tunnel time more, should I say, than give us some sort of drawback on our points. Maybe that's what happened, we'll never know, but I suppose moving forwards, if there is a more serious breach, we can see whether the FIA are willing to push the issue of points deduction, because, as you say, they've done it before and they could well do it again. And staying with Red Bull in some sort of sense, their driver Max Verstappen won his 14th race this season at Mexico just days ago, and you'd be forgiven for thinking, so what? It's standard procedure for him to win a race this season, but no, this Grand Prix win was special because it means that Max Verstappen has now won the most race wins in a single season of F1, passing the lesser-known drivers of Michael Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel. So what do we make then of the Dutchman smashing that record when it comes to surpassing more modern Formula One heroes?
Record breaking, literally, and it's crazy to think that he's managed to do that in one season. It's also crazy to think that at the start of the year we were talking about Ferrari versus Red Bull, Verstappen versus Leclerc, a titanic battle, a titanic season coming up ahead, and we're sitting here now with Verstappen having won 14 out of 20 races, which is utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. For context, I've just looked this up in the last couple of minutes. So obviously, like you said, the record amount of wins in one season is now 14. It was 13 by Michael Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel, who got 13 each in one season. Only two drivers in F1 history have a higher win percentage than Verstappen in one season. One of them's a bit unrepresentative. Alberto Ascari won 6 races out of 8 in 1952, so he had more opportunities to get a higher percentage. But Michael Schumacher won 13 out of 18 races in 2004, therefore giving him a 72.22 win percentage, which Verstappen, if he won the last 2 races, could go past and effectively he would hold the record for a season greater than 8 races. In terms of win percentage. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, we've been over this many times at various points. You almost run out of superlatives to describe Verstappen. This is another race where, yes, he had the fastest car, and yes, he was in a position where it fell into his lap, but he had things which were going against him. He had a quick Mercedes, who looked like they may have been on the better strategy at certain points in the Grand Prix. Mm-hmm. He had a start from pole position where, the longest run down to the first corner all season, and therefore an inherent disadvantage in terms of being able to give everyone behind him a tow and a sort of almost like a leg up on the way down to turn 1. And also bear in mind, amongst these 14 wins, this was only his 6th pole position of the whole year. 6 poles, 14 wins is ridiculous in my opinion, because it shows how strong his racecraft is and how strong of an overall driver he is to be up near the front of the grid and then deliver on race day. And also, all those times where he's not been near the front of the grid, as in that trio of races, Hungary, Belgium, Italy, where he started 10th, 14th and 7th, and he still won. He still came through the field. He still smashed it out of the park. And when you compare, I said about 6 poles, 14 wins. When you compare that to Charles Leclerc, who has 9 poles but only 3 wins, that shows how dominant Verstappen has been in races, and how he's been able to harness his car's ability and just really harness its speed and its power to his advantage. Other ridiculous stats: he's won 8 out of the last 9 races. Once again, crazy. That's since Ferrari took their last win. He just dominates races. He won this one by 15 seconds. He nursed those tyres for, 41 laps or something from the time when he put them on, or even more possibly. And that link you sent us, Tristan, of his lap times of the whole race, where he was within the same 1 second. He was in the 1 minute 22s for, if you take out the virtual safety car, he was in that for 43 consecutive laps in the same like 1 second barrier, which is incredible consistency. Like, realistically, you see drivers' lap times over a stint sometimes dropping off or easing off, but he was just persistently consistent, literally. And he's breaking records all over. He's still so young as well. He's 25, for goodness sake. He's not even at his peak. And it could go two ways. It could go the Sebastian Vettel way, where he hits his peak really early and then goes down a slippery slope, and has a combination of like that and cars not being suited to him. But like at the moment, this has definitely the impression of Verstappen becoming the dominant driver of this generation. And we had a discussion in the past about the next generation, like the championship battles between Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, George Russell, Carlos Sainz, to name a few, Lando Norris, to name a few. At this rate, we're not going to see those battles because this man's just going to keep on hoovering up race wins. He's got 34 of them already. The names above him in the all-time list: Hamilton, Schumacher, Senna, Prost, Vettel. Not bad. So he's got so much time to extend these records, so much time to get even better. I think we've seen last year the Verstappen that won the championship was still a bit more impulsive, a bit more not agitated. He was still a lot more of a mature driver because clearly he was up for and won a championship fight. But this year we've just seen a ruthless, relaxed, dominant Verstappen. I feel like all year he hasn't even really needed to be. I remember last year distinctly he was very aggressive in racecraft towards Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, the Mercedes. But this year I feel like he's been so far ahead all the time. He's been on another planet. And even when he has had to come through, he's been so calm and calculated with his racecraft. He has not had any bumps or shunts. His 2 retirements came from mechanicals. Other than Singapore, where he had an off day, he's been flawless in every race, pretty much. I say flawless. He spun in Hungary, still won. So, like, the man's just like, yeah, he's an absolute machine. And Mexico City Grand Prix this weekend was another example of that. And yeah, he's just on a one-man domination mission at the moment, and I can see that continuing because he's in utterly ridiculous form. He is a sports person, a sportsman at the top of their art, the top of their craft. And I think whilst people will complain and may say that it's getting a bit repetitive, I think at the same time it's good to appreciate when someone is right at the top of their game, in their, not just in sport, but just in their profession in general. And that's certainly what he is right now. He's seeming unstoppable.
Yeah, absolutely, he is. And it's such a shame you got there before me when it came to reading out the consistency of Max Verstappen, because it was absolutely insane. And I mean, I think we were all very, very surprised by the fact that Max Verstappen could stay on those medium tyres for such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, from our perspective, have no degradation in performance. And that's actually pretty ridiculous. I mean, that's from lap 27 to lap 71 on the set mediums. And those are not designed. Well, theoretically, they're not designed to go that far. Clearly, Pirelli did manage to design a tyre that could. And it surprised us all. I think it even surprised Mercedes, who were basically counting on those tyres wearing down. The race engineers kept saying to Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, "Oh no, it's okay. They're going to lose performance. They're going to lose performance. Don't you worry. They're going to get slow, and that will be your time to strike," because they were on the hard tyres, which are designed to go for much longer. And it never happened. For some reason, the Mexican Grand Prix just had incredibly low tyre degradation. It was a bit bizarre, really. So we not only, I think, did we have Max Verstappen's incredible performance and racecraft, but also yet again, Red Bull's strategy team managed to pull something out of the bag, and they weren't the only one to do really, really well. McLaren managed to also capitalise on that by giving Daniel Ricciardo softs at the end, which gave him a fantastic turn of speed. So Red Bull definitely again had that, double threat you have Max Verstappen, who is an incredibly talented racing driver, paired with a team that can get their act together, which I think Ferrari is looking at going, oh, wouldn't that be nice? Because currently it seems like they've only got the talent in the cars at the moment. And I mean, Ferrari would know to be seen. And so I think it was, and maybe you might say it was a bit of a gamble that Red Bull did this, and they should have had to have stopped again, because even Pirelli said that the fastest strategy was soft, medium, and things like that. They was, suggesting you stop twice to get the fastest possible strategy. But Red Bull showed that yet again they read the track, and it paid off fantastically. I mean, in other sports like golf, we talk about reading the greens and testing for wind and things like that, because you're supposed to assess your circumstances to play the unpredictable shot sometimes, or to optimize your shots. And I feel like that's what Red Bull is able to do this year perfectly. They are able to read the track, read the weather. And we paired with Max Verstappen, who seems to have, in the face of adversity, a uncanny ability to just fight back, as it was in the Circuit of America or this race, to pump out the same lap time over and over and over again. It reminds me of the Michael Schumacher days, when he would put in qualifying lap times, lap after lap after lap. And that's something that has to be absolutely respected here. So I'm not surprised that he has gone on to beat the overall record for the number of race wins this season. It's worth mentioning, I think, out of respect to those who he has now beaten for this record, that 2022 has the largest and longest calendar at 23 races, whereas, for example, in 2019 there was only 21 races. So Max does actually have more opportunities to win races, and that also feeds into points as well, because he now has the most points ever scored in a single season. And there are more points up for grabs. He's now got 416 points. So by the end of the season, I could see him perhaps winning another couple of races. I mean, is it beyond him to win Brazil followed by Abu Dhabi?
Not at all. I could easily do it for sure. Yes, I mean, congratulations to Verstappen. I did not see this record being broken, because I first of all didn't know the record of 14 or 13 races was the record for a number of races won in one season. And I was kind of surprised, really, that it was only Schumacher and Vettel, I say only, but only those two drivers who were holding that accolade jointly. I somehow thought that Hamilton would be up there, albeit, perhaps surpassing them as well after breaking so many other records and being so close last season. But perhaps that just shows that with a bit of revisionism, if you will, we need to go and look at Valtteri Bottas's time at Mercedes and go, oh, well, if he was able to keep Hamilton below winning 13 races in one season, in a modern Formula 1 season as well, or calendar, which are far larger and bigger, as you said there, Tristan, than, let's say, the old Formula 1 calendars when someone like Fangio was racing, for example. So this is very much a modern metric to go and measure the great drivers of our time. But I think that Verstappen is only going to grow and grow in terms of points, in terms of race wins, be it this season and next season as well. Hinting at the cost cap there, I don't think that's going to slow him down too much because of, let's say, his racecraft ability and the power and the consistency that he's shown at this race and really throughout the entire season, and because he's backed up by some of the best in Formula 1 and in terms of designing a competitive car at Adrian Newey and company, really. So congratulations to Verstappen there, as I say. I think he will now go on to dominate Formula 1. It's just a question now of whether, as Angus said, the Leclercs, the Norrises, the Hamiltons, the Russells can keep up with this person, because it's not only a case of having a very good team, it's extracting the very best out of that car that you have, because, as we've said so many times, Red Bull probably don't have the fastest car when it comes to just raw pace. Routinely, we see Ferrari topping the timesheets when it comes to Fridays and Saturdays, but it's a Red Bull, i.e. Verstappen and occasionally Perez, that comes through to claim it where it really matters. So that's the dangerous thing. It's not just a case of it's not just a case of Verstappen having the fastest car and rinsing that and using that to his advantage when other cars are behind him and dilapidated when it comes to power and performance. It's him taking what's good and making it great, really. So that's what we've seen from the very best in Formula 1. We see it with Vettel, we see it with Alonso now, not having the best cars but pulling the very best out of them. Hamilton as well, perhaps not so much in this year, but in years gone by, he's not always had the fastest car. Look at McLaren, for example, back in sort of 2007, 2008, regularly causing serious uncomfort there for competitors and other cars as well, really. So that's the real, in my mind, the real litmus test of a great driver who isn't a great driver to be, because it's one thing to do it in a great car, it's another thing to do it in a good car or a fairly good car. So yes, everyone's got to catch up, but I don't see that happening this season. It may be a while until we see somebody else take over from being the dominant force in Formula 1. I think there are the drivers out there with the capability to do that, but Ferrari need to pull themselves together in more ways than one. Mercedes need to improve themselves as well. We know that it's always heavily hinted at, should I say, that Hamilton will likely remain in the sport. There's hints of him signing a multi-year contract coming up. So can he sort of row back the years, if you will, and pull out the best of what is unlikely to be the very best car, because we've got Ferrari doing so well in terms of what they can produce as a package, Red Bull as well, and Mercedes playing catch up with the new set of rules. So roll on the next few years, it's going to be very interesting to see who can claim the top prize in both championships, really. And while I'm talking about Mercedes and them rolling back the years or needing to in the future, they did this very much on Saturday when they qualified in P2 and 3 and did quite well in the race as well, P2 and 4 in terms of their finishing positions. Hamilton in second, he came from third, and Russell falling down to fourth and second after a poor start there. It's worth saying they both started on the mediums when the bulk of the front runners were on the faster, softer tyres. And around sort of lap 26, lap 27, as we sort of mentioned earlier there, Hamilton was catching Max sort of 2 seconds behind him, give or take. But once Verstappen pitted, Hamilton went for hards, and that really was that in many ways. There was the chance, the window of opportunity, and it closed very much in Mercedes' face. There a chance to win their first ever Grand Prix, maybe in the eyes of many. Do you think that they missed a trick there in terms of not capitalising on what was probably, if not their best, then certainly a great qualifying record when it comes to this season and comparing where they have been previously in earlier races?
Just don't think they have the speed. It would have taken something really magical, right, for Mercedes to have pulled out a win from that, given everything we know that occurred. Not just the strategy. I mean, I think the best hope would have been to listen to George Russell, actually, during the race. And feel free to disagree with me, but George said, I don't want to come in for hard tyres. They started on the mediums, Mercedes, which, Red Bull starting on the softs gave them the advantage in the early stint. Red Bull, chose that path, and Mercedes went, right, we're going to choose a different path. We're going to start on the mediums. That gives you longevity, and then the idea being that you then overcut your competition, i.e. you stay out longer, and whilst your competition then has to heat up their slightly harder compound tyres, because Red Bull started on softs, and then they have to heat up their mediums, Mercedes stay out a bit longer, come in, change, and I thought to the softs, brilliant, that means they take a short amount of time to heat up, but then you're on the softer compound, the stickier compound, the faster compound, whilst your competition is on the slower compound, you're on the faster ones, overtake them, boom, you win. But that's not what happened, and I think that's what George wanted to happen. And they pitted both of them, George and Lewis, onto the hard tyres, and in the end, both drivers sort of just fell back. And what was bizarre to me was they made both drivers do the same thing. And I don't know if this was just an accidental slip or they didn't want one driver to feel a bit hurt that the other had this performance advantage or whatever. But if I'm Mercedes and I'm thinking, right, this is probably our best chance for a while to win a race, and we've got two drivers, one of which is desperately calling for a different strategy, don't you say, okay, we've got nothing to lose here. We'll we'll try it. But, on your head be it, George, and your head be it. And in the end, I think it actually would have worked out really well for George, given that what we know about the low degradation in Mexico. So I think absolutely, Tom, they missed a trick. I think they had an opportunity to try something new, even if it was close, even if they didn't win. But we saw this amazing, pace advantage strategy. We'd be sitting here thinking, yeah, actually, do you know what? You tried something really, really good. And it didn't pay off, but we saw how it was going to play out if you had a bit longer, whatever. But instead, they sort of went a bit conservative. Ferrari were nowhere to be seen, and Mercedes, instead of trying something new, knowing that they had a bit of, a space advantage, didn't bother. And in the end, pitted George to get him his fastest lap, which shows you that they had a free pit stop by the end of the race. So they, as I say, nothing to lose. Even if they had to have pitted George again, right? The time deficit by the end of the race means he was safe. Even if you protected Lewis Hamilton by giving him a conservative strategy, just getting him to the end of the race, banking those points, I think they had an opportunity with George to do something magic. But they decided against it. And I think that was a bit of a shame and a bit of a departure from the Mercedes that we know. They didn't go for an aggressive strategy, but starting on the mediums, I felt like they really had to. So, I don't know what went on in Mercedes, but I think they'll be kicking themselves. I would be.
It's interesting because I think I'm of the view, realistically, that there was one thing which stopped Mercedes from winning, and it wasn't their lack of pace. I think that thing is called Max Verstappen. But obviously we've waxed lyrical about him plenty so far this podcast, so I want to dedicate a bit more time to Mercedes and their race. I think at the end of the day, they had a strategy which they thought would work, they thought would come through to them, they thought would make the race not fall in their lap, but sort of come towards them, I guess. And that was a fair point of view to have, based on the way that, I think at the end of the day, when you have a debate between drivers and strategists on the radio, I think it's incredibly difficult for strategists to go with a driver's gut feeling, because at the end of the day, championships are won on many things, but one of those factors is good core strategists and engineers who have systems and methodologies for working out the best way to win a race, to get to the end of a race in the shortest possible time. And I think if I was in that team, I would be more inclined to trust a bunch of strategists who have all those calculations in front of them, as opposed to a driver's gut feel. And whilst, of course, the driver is another one of those components to a successful championship-winning team, I think that, with the greatest respect to George Russell, I think the strategists are more likely to know what they're doing when it comes to strategy. I mean, it's in their name. I just said it in that sentence. It's in their name. So I think that whilst he may have been frustrated that they didn't go with his way or try something different, I think that at the same time they may have felt that there was... I know Ferrari were well off it the whole weekend, but I think that it's something which, even then, you're putting yourself at risk of being behind Ferrari and then compromising your race even more. Like, Mexico isn't a easy place to overtake. I know they got that massive long pit straight, but you have lots of tight and twisty sections as well, such as the stadium section and the bit at the back end of the circuit where there's tight corners. So track position is key, and I think that losing track position in that scenario wouldn't have been beneficial at all for them. So I can see why they didn't go with what Russell said, realistically. And with Hamilton's strategy, I just think, once again, they were just outdriven by a driver in supreme form who was able to hold on medium tyres for 46 laps or something like that, whatever it was, possibly longer. So, I think that Mercedes didn't necessarily mess this one up. It comes across as worse because, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but 20 races in and Mercedes have not won a race this season, which is crazy. First time in 11 years I've been able to say that. And there's more scrutiny, I think, on them because they haven't won that race. They haven't got that race win out the way. And Austin was one where they thought they'd go well. They didn't. go massively well. That realistically, I thought they did okay, but they needed Verstappen's slow pit stop to be back in the picture. And Mexico is one where we thought, they probably won't go so well. But then in the end, they went really well, because the whole thing of the high altitude, which thins the air and makes the engine, the difference in engine performance less, which in the past years used to shaft Mercedes, this year shafted Red Bull a bit. So that brought Merc back into contention. I think for those reasons, the fact that we were like, oh, they could win a race this weekend. They're second and third. They got the long run down to turn 1. They could have got pole had mistakes not been made. And we're like, oh, hang on, something's brewing here. Something's brewing for Mercedes. But then it's probably just our views are skewed when we look at it and we see the end result, having had our expectations so high. And the fact that they haven't yet won a race.
That was a shame, wasn't it? I really did hold that hope that via strategy and not via performance, because we know that Mercedes are still lacking in that versus an all-firing Red Bull and Verstappen, that they could have, by hook or by crook, got themselves the first race win. I think it would be a failure of a season if they don't get that win, because there have been chances, and yes, they are lower on their overall package versus 2 other constructors, but Mercedes have 2 great drivers, they have a great team behind them, and they have, in some parts you could say, had chances to go and win races. You could go and look at this one, for example, go back to the Dutch Grand Prix as well, Singapore, when you look at qualifying in isolation, they have had half chances, but chances nonetheless. And the start was so important, wasn't it? And when I saw Russell sort of get onto the curbs and sort of the car catapult itself back on to the tarmac, I thought, this doesn't look good. And then him falling down to 4th and Perez coming into the fight and then making it 2 versus 2 in terms of constructors was always going to be an uphill battle. But I did think it was a bit disappointing that Mercedes didn't show ambition, aggression, and were far more conservative, as Tristan hinted at there, because when we look historically, and when I say historically, I mean the Dutch Grand Prix, for example, you had George Russell going, right, let's go for the softs. And they said, no, we're going to go for the mediums. He said, no, let's go for the softs. And what happened? Well, George Russell got himself a mighty fine P2. Hamilton stuck with the mediums, if memories serves me correctly, and he was then nowhere to be seen. So I think that there was a case of, why not learn from the past, i.e. Russell has made good calls in the past about, let's dump these older tyres for softs, and let's do it this way, because, and it's easy to say, I suppose, the hards have always been this season very slow to fire up, and we saw this again. It's easy for me to say after the event, but we've seen throughout the entire of this calendar really that mediums and softs are seemingly the way to go. They get a good balance of raw pace, and then also they're fairly durable as well. And when you look at the mediums and don't give away too much, I suppose, in terms of, I suppose, the pace and the durability sort of balance. Is more the sort of Goldilocks, if you will, of the tyre world. But it was always going to be difficult, always going to be a tall order. But Mercedes, I think really they've been semi-traumatised by the season in a small sort of way from a team strategy perspective. They've almost seen how low they've been in terms of sort of relativity, in terms of third place by default, not really competing with the 2 constructors above them, but still being good enough to not be drawn into the midfield pack in splendid isolation. And they've gone, blimey, this has been a really rough season, let's just bank any points we can get and just hope that something else happens to another car in terms of reliability, which is not a foolish way to look at the situation, because Mercedes have been uber reliable when it comes to their power units, to their cars. The only times they've been out of races is owing to collisions and crashes. So I understand the logic, but it is a bit disappointing to see Mercedes regress and almost be scarred by their lack of performance and go, let's just take any points we can get. So hopefully that is something that doesn't continue to rumble on for seasons to come. I don't think it will be. I think that the new regulations have shocked them and they'll be back to their sort of former selves, i.e. competing for race wins on merit versus anything else. But yeah, when you had a 1-2 in terms of P2 and 3 versus one driver, we've seen historically 2 versus 1 is such a powerful sort of battle or strategy to your advantage if you can create those circumstances. And on Saturday they did have the chance to go and execute that moving into Sunday, because if they isolated Perez away from the battle and sort of got Max on his own, they would have had a good chance there. And as we saw, no Ferraris anywhere to be seen in terms of the top 4 or 5, which they've had a rough season as well, but that's a rarity because they've always qualified well, as we hinted at earlier, but this Grand Prix was not one of them. And it seems that's all we got time for in terms of episode 36 of F1 in Review. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this one, be it this on your preferred podcast provider or via River Radio, be that live or via the Listen Back feature. The Brazilian Grand Prix is next, but that's 2 weeks away, so we'll be back next week to unpack more things that came from the Mexican Grand Prix, and no doubt a whole range of other issues next week, like, I don't know, maybe the Haas and Williams seats for next year, if they're finalised. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.